live here in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Quinn Martindale, he, him. I'm a member of Austin DSA and the National Electoral Committee. Tonight, I'm joined by a couple guests to talk about how to use elected office to build socialism. So often when we are thinking about electoral politics in DSA, we are thinking about the campaigning process. So we are selecting who we want to endorse, we are knocking on doors, and we are doing the work of actually getting voters to show up at the polls on election day and put people into office. But that's all for a purpose. We have seen how DSA elected officials across the country have done work to advance socialism. We have seen everyone from everyone across the country doing work to advance socialism and serve as organizers in office. So today I have two people who are doing that work, who are wanting to share their experiences and talk about how we can use elected office to build socialism. Alderman Carlos Rosa serves as vice chair of the Chicago City Council's Latino Caucus. He's dean of the Democratic Socialist Caucus and a member of the City Council's Progressive Caucus and LBGTQ Caucus. Faynan Laka is a socialist organizer based in New York City. She serves on the steering committee of New York City DSA and is a member of the DSA National Electoral Committee. She previously worked as campaign manager for New York State Senator Jabari Bisport and currently works as deputy chief of staff for New York State Assembly member Farrah Sifrant Forrest. Faynan, did you want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a socialist in office?
Yeah, or at least to work for one and with one. Yeah, so I mean, I think like Quinn said, like we talked so much about campaigning, and I have a lot to say about campaigning. I think in a lot of ways, it's like very, very important for us to first figure out what it means to run socialist campaigns. But our goal is to win, not just win any election, but win many elections, and not just win many elections, but win, a socialist society and win, the power for the working class to democratize our resources in a way that will, allow us to carry out that kind of big, large-scale transformation. That's a really big ambition. It's a lot, and in a sense, it's a lot whenever you win a campaign because the question then becomes like, how do we advance this set of goals, this like very ambitious set of goals, in a context where practically everyone else who's thinking about politics, even if they're progressive and are like genuinely going to be your very strong ally, are just not thinking in that way. There's a qualitatively different kind of way we think about what our political project is as socialists, and that has a lot that comes to bear in pretty big ways on what it's possible to think about trying to do in office. So I want to talk about two sort of broadly connected aspects of this. I think for any elected official, there's always a kind of, it's an artificial distinction. In a lot of ways, it falls apart, but I think it's also just kind of the analytically useful is think about legislation and what one is doing in the policy world and as a sort of legislator, and then there's like what you're doing in the district, what you're doing with your district office, and how you're trying to build in the community that you've been elected from. So I'll just talk about each of those and try to keep it somewhat brief, but I think there's a lot to share out of our experience in New York and in particular out of Farrah's office. That's kind of exciting to think about and can be useful for those of us who are winning elections and are setting things up in other places. So in New York, we we elected Julia Salazar to the state senate in 2018. For 2 years, Julia was on her own, the lone socialist state senator, and she played a historic role in a number of key progressive victories. I think very importantly was the Housing Stability Tenant Protection Act, the HSTPA of 2019, which basically stopped the like decades-long process of erosion of rent stabilization that had been taking place up to that time. She did a lot of great things. She's amazing. You should look her up. But we didn't engage with her in a very, very deep and ongoing way. In part, we didn't have enough knowledge about state politics. We were very fresh and new, and we'd done this really big thing, but sort of didn't know what to do with it. But after 2020, where we ran another 4 people for state office, we decided to do something called set up a Socialist in Office committee. And at the same time as we were like, okay, we're going to set up a committee, this committee being, composed of members of our chapter's leadership as well as the electeds and their staff. We also, we were also thinking about like, what is our policy priority? What is our project? And we really settled on developing some legislation on taxing the rich. And so as we started to come together and put together this committee, we started to think about how can we advance socialist policy goals and use the power we have as, with our elected offices to be able to do that in sync with the outside campaign movement that DSA was going to build and did in fact build in a really big way. I think, and that meant, sort of having an inside-outside strategy, but really coordinating it deeply. So we started to study all together, how does Albany work, what's going to happen. And then, as the legislative session started, tried to figure out like, how to have conversations with people, how to speak up in conference, what kind of arguments to make, how to identify who may need some pressure applied to them. And sort of use the combination of that inside and outside power to be able to build together. I think that was like a very, very exciting first step for this project of like, how are we going to build together? DSA was meeting with, this is Orlando, she's very sweet, but also it's not her time. DSA was able to really, really develop a much wider layer of people who were thinking about how the state legislature works and how to use, and what it means that this is happening. And we ended up having a really successful outcome for the revenue project. We demanded 50 billion, did not get that, but we did get 4.5 billion in new revenue, and we're basically able to close all the budget holes and have the first budget in basically 40 years that wasn't an austerity budget. So through heavy coordination between DSA and our new electeds, really positioning them to understand our projects, giving them a campaign to work around, helping them hire their staff, and building a massive outside movement that had policy sophistication and had a large number of volunteers making phone calls, hanging up door hangers. We were able to make some really big impacts. From there, though, after sort of going through this tax the rich process and having a very a historically progressive budget, we were sort of like left to kind of think like, okay, what do we do next? And we have some other bills that we've been pushing for. So we've been talking about winning public power, as I know many chapters are doing across the country. We have a single payer bill in New York, the New York Health Act. But after the budget, which was a very unifying project, we had all these different campaigns, and it wasn't necessarily everyone was on the same page and really coherent. And another thing happened also, which was that it felt like a lot of the energy to move was around criminal justice things. And DSA doesn't have a statewide campaign around criminal justice. There are ones we're in coalition with, but it meant that we weren't like organizing around racial justice in quite that way at a time when it was very opportune. All of this has since prompted for our Socialist in Office project, a kind of a sort of reflection on the fact that we need to figure out what we're fighting for more. We need to have a clear policy vision. And we also need to cohere our block a little bit more to be able to act in a way that's, very coherent and united. And so that's why we settled on developing a decision-making process that operates based on a majority, 2/3 majority between DSA members and elected officials. And, I feel really excited about what we're going to be able to do as we sort of think about how we can prioritize and operate as a block moving forward. Maybe the one other sort of, interesting thing I'll say about this is that we found in New York that, progressives have been our allies, and that when we've been able to sort of deploy policy and have our electeds sort of organizing internally, we've been able to build a sort of sense of coalition and support behind what we're doing. So, I think the really strong thing has been like, how do we use our socialist vision to animate ideas that are going to be able to gain traction beyond us, and using that as a tool, a deeper understanding of society as a tool to be able to move forward. The district stuff is a quite different terrain. In Farah's office, our operation is broken up into 4 sort of sections. We have days of outreach. So every few weeks, we go knock doors with volunteers, some from the campaign, some from DSA, some who are just constituents that we engage with or have helped with constituent services. So we go knock doors, we talk to people about their issues, we pull in cases for our constituent services team. And we talk about FAIR's policy programs. We talk about what it means that FAIR is a democratic socialist, sort of have that year-round presence and use it as an opportunity to sort of talk about what we're doing ideologically and programmatically. We have our constituent services team. We have there's 3 of us on staff, and Justin Freeman was great. I don't know, is in here right now. But Justin basically organizes a sort of volunteer operation of people helping out with constituent services. And I think people really love this. Like, we set up, a system where like we get cases, we write them up, we distribute them to people through WhatsApp. They take them up, they take notes, and we support them in the process. And that's really cool. And I think also has a really important political role. I worry I'm lagging, forgive me, but has a really important political role because one of the reasons why people have a challenge with socialism and socialists is a sort of distrust of anything the government's going to do. The sense that like the government's not really an effective tool for trying to redistribute wealth, make social change. It's sort of part of the reason why nonprofits are so prevalent. And so even though policies that are getting passed right now are flawed, our ability to make sure that people are able to have a positive experience of receiving benefits from the state, engaging with the state, has actually something meaningfully to do with what we're able to then say is possible politically for the state to be doing for you at an even larger scale. So that's one part. That's the second part. The third part of our operation is tenant organizing. So through our door knocking operation, especially, but also because Farah is a tenant organizer. She is, and she was a union member, and so she has a very deep sort of sense of tenant organizing as a kind of central piece of how we're going to build power in New York City. People contact us with housing issues and we say like, okay, this looks like something that you could do collectively. Are you interested in organizing a tenants association? And we'll basically act as like a tenant organizer, identifying leaders, supporting them, and helping them to be able to kind of grow into something that's able to stand on its own, fight the landlord, or just organize people in a sense that, in a way that has community. I think it's very exciting and important. Again, we try to use volunteers here and deploy them as being the tenant organizer. And my role is often to just kind of support them in being able to do that, nudge them to follow up, hold meetings, put together agendas, etc. And again, we're pulling from DSA here, from the campaign, and from our constituents, and pulling these people in to organizing, as well as identifying the people who are organizing their own buildings. And lastly is neighborhood politics. And this is somewhat underrated. And I think, we don't often think about it because we often think about like organizing straightforwardly. And on campaigns, we're often right to be like, well, all the bullshit the establishment does is in fact bullshit. Everybody is like a self-selecting person who's involved in politics. And so, we deploy massive field operations and a message about fighting for a better future because we're trying to reach a majority, not just a minority of self-selecting people. Who sometimes reflect different class and demographic bases than the majority of a district, for example, not just trying to engage them. When you're in elected office, there's a sort of different thing that happens where these people who are sort of involved in politics and are engaged might want to engage your office. And so it becomes this sort of nuanced thing of like, how do you realign people? Not only towards just like engaging with you and holding you up. So certainly Farah is trying to build relationships, for her own sake, but also to do so in a way that pulls people into supporting our policy programs, pulls them into supporting our campaigns, inviting them to events where Farah's talking about policy and politics. And when she's invited to events, sort of talking about our program and what we're doing. This stuff is complicated and nuanced and challenging. And in Farah's district overlaps with Hakeem Jeffries. There's a very strong counter base of institutional power that's running against us. But nevertheless, like navigating this, being known, and all the school principals, for example, is an important also, I think, way that we are advancing the project in a way that, say, a DSA chapter can't. Just briefly, because I know I've been talking for a little while, I'll talk about the challenges with both of these. So the challenges with our policy work, I think, has been, and I touched on this a little bit, that it's difficult to coordinate legislators. We're all passionate about different things, have slightly different views. there also are sometimes real political differences. People have different analyses of the Democratic Party. People have different analyses of what relationship to have to leadership. People have different analyses about, what we're trying to move and do. And I think all of that is really meaty and also tough to build that sense of unity. And so we've been really trying to think about how can we build that and do that, both by developing ourselves ideologically as well as creating sort of infrastructure to support it. But it is certainly not easy. And then on the district side, I think for using our office, New York, I think, is relatively generous for its lower house. We get 3 staff. It's me, our chief of staff, Tasha, and Justin. So we have, we're a little bit stretched thin. It's part of why we rely on volunteers so much. We have very little money. There's not like extra money for us to move around. In the city council in New York, you have millions of dollars basically to move around to your friends in the nonprofit world and can fund projects. We don't really get that. We have very little money and with a lot of restrictions. Our neighborhood establishment is aligned with Hakeem Jeffries and with the sort of establishment of the very middle class homeowner based Democratic Party establishment in Brooklyn, and it's a challenge for us because it can feel isolating. So, for example, some of the NYCHA TA presidents just aren't really interested in talking to us. NYCHA being the large public housing developments in New York. So there are challenges, there are successes, there is lots of opportunity. In fact, maybe too much constantly coming at us. But I think having a really clear idea of we're trying to advance a project that's about building a mass party, whatever, whether it be in the Democratic Party or outside of it, whatever, but building that sort of sense of we have a mobilized base, a political vision, and we're working to win the reforms that are going to create the space to be able to further advance that struggle has been super helpful in us figuring out how we operate. So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and to hearing what Alderman Rosa has to say.
Alderman Rosa, we really appreciate you joining us tonight. Obviously, you were elected in 2015. You're the Dean of the Democratic Socialist Caucus on the Chicago City Council. Can you kind of talk about what you see the role of a Democratic Socialist in a city council as being?
Absolutely. Good evening. Good evening, comrades. It's so great to join with so many wonderful Democratic Socialists from across the nation this evening. I think it's important for us to reflect on the fact that about 100 years ago, there were over 1,000 Democratic Socialists elected to local office across the United States. Today, we're at about over 100 Democratic Socialists elected across our country. And what did those Democratic Socialists do 100 years ago? They fought for public transportation, they fought for public libraries, they fought for public schools. They helped build up the public infrastructure, the social safety net, all of the things that we love about our cities and our towns today, and that in many ways we take for granted. And so I think that as American socialists, we have to continue to think about our legacy, our past, what our socialist movement has accomplished in our country, and what we need to continue to work towards and accomplish moving forward. There are about 3 things that really guide my role as a Democratic Socialist in the Chicago City Council. One of them is called not me, us, right? We've all heard Bernie Sanders say that so many times. And for me, what that's really about is building a mass people's movement, is understanding that the change that we want to see is not going to be created in the halls of power by me butting up with the special interests, with the entrenched powers that be. I'm not going to be able to create the type of change that we want to see by playing golf with the rich and powerful. It's going to take people out in the streets. It's going to take people organizing. It's going to take that mass people's movement in order to really create the type of world that has social and economic justice that we know we deserve. The other principle that I really follow as a Democratic Socialist in elected office is shifting the balance of power between the capitalist class and the working class. I think that's something that's always at the heart of everything that I do, right? We understand that the capitalist class controls what we do in the workplace. They control so much of what happens in politics. They control, who gets contracts in our cities and in our small towns and in our states. They control who often is elected to office. So how do we shift that balance of power between the capitalist class and working class and make sure that we have real democracy in the workplace and in our society? And then lastly is the concept of non-reformist reforms, right? How do we enter this electoral system, right? And put forward policy demands, put forward policy proposals that help increase the quality of life of working people, while at the same time transforming our society and building our capacity to win even more. And I think that those three principles, right? Not me, us, that mass people's movement, shifting the balance of power between the capitalist class and the working class, right? Engaging in those non-reformist reforms. I think that those are three principles that are linked together, right? Because we can't have non-reformist reforms, right, without putting forward policy demands that help shift the balance of power between the capitalist class and the working class, right? We can't have those non-reformist reforms without building that mass people's movement. So those are kind of the three principles that I really have at the heart of my advocacy as an elected official in the Chicago City Council and as a socialist. And then I guess a fourth one would be participatory democracy, right? Because that's what we want as democratic socialists, right? We want that democracy in the workplace. We want that democracy in our society. So one of the things that has been critically important for me has been ensuring that, in everything that I do, that I'm focusing on building that mass people's movement, that I'm focusing on bringing people along with me in this fight, and that I am devolving power to the working class in my community. So, obviously, if you're an elected official in a small town or wherever you may be, every, local system is going to be different, right? In the state of Illinois, our state reps really get one full-time staffer, right? So they don't have the 3 full-time staffers that exist in New York. In the Chicago City Council, I get about 5 full-time staffers, which is a lot of people, right, to be able to help me with the work that I'm engaging in. So I use those full-time staffers to do things like, one, each alderman every year allocates $1.3 million in ward infrastructure improvements. So we have democratized that process through participatory budgeting, right? So that we reach out to the working people in my district to say, look, you don't need some rich and powerful person. You don't need, some Democratic Party boss deciding which streets will get, resurfaced, which sidewalks will get fixed. We democratically in our communities can decide the infrastructure improvements that we would like to see. One thing that's unique to the position that I have as well is that I oversee all zoning and development decisions in my community. So another thing that we've done is we've developed a system of community-driven zoning and development where we actually call upon the community to sit across the table from rich and powerful developers and negotiate community benefits agreements, negotiate the inclusion of affordable housing in the upzoning and in the developments that they're going to be building in our community. And then what we've also done is we've used our office to create a community defense committee that was created shortly after President Trump was elected. So we said we're going to defend the most vulnerable members of our community, which in that point in time were our undocumented immigrant neighbors. And we said we're actually going to put our bodies on the line to prevent ICE from deporting people in our community. That community defense committee has now expanded the scope of its work to also include our homeless neighbors, so that when our neoliberal mayor, said that the police were going to disrupt and displace a homeless encampment in our community, neighbors came together and actually put their bodies on the line to say no, right? The solution to homelessness is housing. We demand that the city invest money into getting people into dignified homes. And until the city does that, we are going to say no to sweeps in our community. So that's really the focus of, the kind of the day-to-day organizing work in my community. It's just finding every single opportunity in my community to grow that people power, right? To devolve the power from my office and put it into the hands of our community so that our community understands that they don't need the Donald Trumps, right? They don't need the billionaire class. They don't need the Jeff Bezos to be telling them what to do. That we, the working people, the working class, the poor, that we can come together and we can control our destiny, right? And that it's us, the working class, that is going to come up with the best decisions for our community. So we do that on zoning and development. We do that on the expenditure of infrastructure dollars. And then, of course, we also do that on the issue of protecting the most vulnerable neighbors in our community. On the legislative front, those same principles that I talked about, right? Those non-reformist reforms, building that people power, right? Shifting the balance of power between the capitalist class and the working class, those values also come into play. And so during my first term in the Chicago City Council from 2015 to 2019, I was the only Democratic Socialist. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard the term lone wolf. This notion that, there are people that are really well-intended, but they're out there by themselves, right? Doing things without any real support. So the question is how could I ensure that I wasn't going to be a lone wolf in the Chicago City Council? And the way that we addressed that issue in Chicago was by making sure that when I took up a legislative issue, it was as an extension of a grassroots movement. So during my first term, when victims of police torture came to me and said, we want to institute community control of the police, we want to make sure that those people that have been most impacted by racist policing have a say on what policing looks like in their community. They couldn't find a single other alderman to introduce that ordinance for them. But I said, you know what? You all are people that have been directly impacted by this issue. You are the people that are fighting to change this, the direction of racist policing in the city of Chicago. I'm going to ally myself with you. And I introduced that ordinance with them, and I've been the champion of that ordinance alongside them for the last 5 years. And the city of Chicago just passed one of the strongest civilian oversight ordinances in the country as a result of that inside-outside strategy, as a result of me being an extension of the people that were out in the streets, knocking on doors, protesting, marching. I was just one alderman, but because there was a whole grassroots movement behind me in this legislative work, they were able to lobby other aldermen, and we were able to build a powerful coalition to eventually pass that transformative piece of legislation. Similarly, when undocumented immigrant activists came to me and said, we want to make Chicago a true sanctuary city, where in no case, no exception, can the local police work to deport the undocumented residents of the city of Chicago, I said, absolutely, I'm going to introduce that ordinance. And so I introduced it, and I always subsumed my advocacy and my leadership on this issue to them. And so I didn't do anything on this ordinance without it being discussed and without it being part of a collaborative strategy with the grassroots activists that were leading on this issue. And as a result of that inside-outside strategy, as a result of me working as an extension of that grassroots movement in the Chicago City Hall, we passed one of the nation's strongest sanctuary city ordinances. We're now in the city of Chicago with no case, no exception, can the local police or local officials work to deport undocumented residents. Similarly, we've also worked to do things like divest from fossil fuels. Grassroots activists came to me and said, Alderman, we want to work with you to bring this issue forward in the Chicago City Council. They're working the outside strategy. I'm working the inside strategy. So I shared these things with you just to give you a sense of, how it is that I approach my work, right? We've heard Bernie Sanders say it so many times. I've said it multiple times too during this short time that we've had together. Not me, us. I think that's the critical thing. I think that liberals think that, they can come up with a really good policy solution. They can get the data, they can get the research behind it, and then they can have, some lunch meetings and convince the powers that be, right? That poor people, that queer people, that trans people, right? That Black people, that Indigenous people, that people of color, that undocumented immigrants deserve justice and basic dignity. But we know that's not true, right? We know that power concedes nothing without a demand. And we know that it's working people and poor people coming together that create the change that we want to see. And so as a Democratic Socialist in office, that is constantly what I have at the forefront, right, of the work that I do, right? Not me, us. How do we use our positions to build that mass people's movement? How do we use our positions to shift the balance of power between the capitalist class and the working class, right? How do we put forward those non-reformist reforms that as we fight for those really important changes, like for example, Medicare for all, right? We know that working people desperately need to have access to healthcare as a human right, right? That in the process of working for that really important change, we're actually building out the campaigns, we're actually building out the capacity that bring more people into our struggle, right? And make us even stronger so we can win even more.
Oh, that's
inspiring. Oh my God.
Thank you so much. That's a great reminder, I think, for where we are and how to move forward. So we're going to take some questions from the audience. We've already had a couple submitted. And kind of thinking about that not me, us, and the inside out strategy of working together with the community of working together, with the DSA chapters. Finan, you had talked earlier about a decision-making process with DSA and with electeds, and we had a member kind of asked to elaborate on what that looks like and maybe an example of how that works in practice.
Yeah, so it's something we like ratified at our recent retreat that we had like 3 weeks ago. It had been something we sort of set about starting to build a couple of months ago. I think that the fundamental relationship between, our movement and our electeds can't be one of like demanding that you just do what we say. Can't be one of being like, you're accountable to us and that's the story. That's not the case for a couple of reasons. I think the biggest is that you could be, a DSA chapter or whoever like could be wrong about what's necessary to do next. And the elected official may in fact just have a better analysis based on their proximity. Trying to overcome that knowledge barrier is part of why we set up the Socialist and Office Committee in the first place, so that the conditions of the legislature are reflected on our organization, and the conditions of our movement, our demands, what we're sensing on the ground is reflected back towards the electeds. So there's that, I think there's also, and so whatever. Anyway, all of that is to say, like, fundamentally, like I think we have strived to think about this as a project where we're trying to build support for each other and strengthen DSA and strengthen our electeds. In general, that's been pretty effective. Where we've encountered challenges, and I think the reason why we wanted to be able to build a decision-making process is because we want to be able to act, to be able to vote together really consistently, when things are hard. We want to be able to prioritize things in a way that allows all of us to move on them in sync. And that has sometimes been challenging. So for example, I mentioned the budget. The budget was a very difficult time for us because some of our electeds were like, this is the first budget to break through austerity in 40 years. It includes really, really important reforms, including billions of dollars for undocumented people. And there were right-wing Democrats who voted, 17 of them in the assembly, who were voting against it. The threat, the sense of like the right was coming after us is like a really serious one. And it was a historic budget, and it was and these are serious gains we need to defend. And on the other hand, there's just the sense that like we fought for 50 billion, we were talking about a different kind of state. This isn't that. Are we going to, are our votes going to reflect, this kind of, acceding to, a politics that feels like compromising. This was like a really challenging thing. We weren't able to really come to a clear consensus, in part because we hadn't laid out the ideological foundations, hadn't thought through what we're doing in a way that led us up to it. So it's really been coming out of that experience of challenge, in fact, that there are like relatively nuanced questions that come before us that we need some way of resolving them that's going to hold the group together, but just doesn't feel like everyone is doing whatever. And so like the stake of working together feels like it's minimized. So the decision-making process basically is like people can like bring forward a motion to have a discussion about something. There's a period of discussion. We then decide to move forward with the discussion towards voting. We have formal debate on the issue. And then we take a vote, and there's like a kind of elaborate set of criteria for what constitutes a majority, like a passing vote for this. We haven't tried it out yet. I think, the legislature is out of session in New York until the beginning of July or beginning of January, but who knows? Governor Cuomo, we're about, I think, very likely to impeach Governor Cuomo, and so, there will be some sort of navigating of the waters of that, although it may just be pretty uncontroversial in our group. Yeah, so that's what I got to answer that.
Thanks. Alderman Rosa, Maddie asks if you could clarify the relationship between the community defense communities you talked about that were defending against deportations and the Chicago city government, whether there's any sort of official relationship there, and then how those communities got started in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I used to work for a congressman, a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And one of the things that I learned there was that at the federal level, there's actually a prohibition on members of the legislature using the resources of their office to engage in grassroots organizing. So for example, a member of Congress can speak at a rally for Medicare for All, but they can't actively tell their staff to go recruit people to attend that rally for Medicare for All. Well, at the Chicago City Council, there is no such prohibition. And so what that means is that we've been able to use our staff to act as organizers. One of the things that I mentioned is that, I'm very lucky to have a number of full-time staff. And so we have one staffer that focuses, obviously they have their whole host of duties, picking up phones, dealing with constituent services, dealing with, requests to get new trash cans. But in addition to that, I have one staffer that focuses exclusively on participatory budgeting, right? And so, their kind of organizing process is identifying leaders in each of the neighborhoods that I represent, bringing them into that process with the focus of bringing in marginalized communities, poor people, working class people, to be the ones that are discussing what are the infrastructure improvements and building up their capacity to make really good decisions on infrastructure in our community. Similarly, with the Community Defense Committee, it's an actual project of my ward office. So if you go to my website, www.aldermancarlosrosa.org, you will find a section there about the Community Defense Committee. And so I have a staffer who, in addition to their full-time, duties dealing with constituent services, they also focus exclusively on organizing the Community Defense Committee. And so we actually, during, the first, 2 years of President Trump's presidency, we organized a number of civil disobedience trainings to really teach people in our community, right? One, how do you engage in cop watching or ICE watching, right? How do you safely, from a distance, take out your phone, record what's happening, report it to the proper, channels of, deportation defense organizers so that they can verify if in fact that is or is not ICE and get the word out if need be. But then we also prepped for a situation where, the community would actually come together and perhaps surround an ICE vehicle and demand that the person that was detained by ICE be released and let go. So those are things that were actually organized through my office. We're very proud to have been able to do that. Again, I recognize that for most local elected officials, they're not going to be in a big city like New York or Chicago, right? So they're probably not going to have all of the staff that we're able to access. But nonetheless, I share that with you as an example of the types of ways that you should just be really focused on using your office to support that grassroots organizing and building that mass people's movement. So, if you're in a place where, you're a part-time legislator, maybe there are leaders in your community, or, maybe you're a part-time city council member or village trustee. Maybe there are people that are in your cadre, that are in your chapter, that can take on some of that work on a volunteer basis. But we absolutely use the resources of the 35th Ward Aldermanic Office in the city of Chicago to support that grassroots organizing work.
Thanks. That's pretty amazing, and it's a very great use of resources that not everyone gets to have. But I'm glad to hear that works so well. I wanted to move to a related question, and we have a member from Central Illinois who's kind of asking what it looks like to work when you have a smaller base of folks in office that you can work with. Obviously, Chicago City Council has a larger caucus, not a majority yet, though hopefully someday. But what are the things that you can be doing, as a single member in office to build a base in the districts where there may not be as much support for Democratic Socialists?
Well, I'll take a shot at answering that question. I think that, as a member of the Chicago City Council, I'm a full-time, legislator. I have a salary that allows me to be a full-time legislator. But as the only Democratic Socialist for the first 4 years that I was in office, I really had to, pick my fights very carefully, because I had to be the legislative champion in the City Council for that issue. And so I really focused in on issues where I knew there was a lot of grassroots support. So of course, in the city of Chicago, we had the horrific murder of Laquan McDonald by the police, shot 16 times and then covered up by Rahm Emanuel, our horrific neoliberal mayor. There was a real popular, visceral response to that. And it manifested itself in the demand at that point in time for community control of the police in 2015 and 2016. So I became the main chief sponsor of the ordinance, the Civilian Police Accountability Council in the Chicago City Council at that time, right? So it was that inside-outside strategy where I was working that ordinance on the inside, talking to my colleagues, and then of course we had all of the grassroots activists, you know, engaging in direct action, organizing press conferences, organizing call-in campaigns, email campaigns, to kind of pressure my colleagues to support, you know, the bill that I had introduced and filed in the Chicago City Council. In the end, I really was able to focus in during my first term on 4 key issues, and that was progressive revenue, that was, you know, immigrant rights and immigrant protections, ending racist policing, and then, you know, focusing on environmental justice, and, you know, divesting from fossil fuels. So that was kind of like that was essentially the extent of what I could focus on. Now that we have a 6-member, you know, 6 members of the Chicago City Council that are Democratic Socialists, we've had the ability to focus on a lot more because many hands make light work. So we've been able to be a lot more effective. We've been able to win more. We've been able to be more strategic. You know, it's wonderful to have colleagues that are leading on different issues. I play a support role, but it's really increased the capacity of the grassroots. I imagine if I were in a smaller, you know, town, if I was in a town of 100,000 or 200,000 people, or maybe 50,000 people, I would really have to figure out, okay, who are the grassroots activists in my community? What are they most galvanized around? And what issue can we really focus in on that can bring the most people into that work? And, you know, once you kind of identify that issue, you know, really maybe focusing on that specific issue in, you know, your town to say, this is really the change that the working class and poor people in my community need at this moment. You know, I'm only a part-time legislator, so I only have you know, several hours per week that I can, you know, you know, focus in on this issue, because of course I have to, you know, work my other, you know, full-time job. But this is what I'm really going to hone in on, and I know that I'm going to have people in my community that are going to have my back, that are going to join me in knocking doors, and that are going to, you know, write op-eds, you know, do direct action. So I imagine that, you know, in a place where you have less resources and perhaps, you know, a smaller progressive movement, you're really going to have to be even more exact and precise in terms of the issues that you pick up.
Thank you. Finan, we had another member ask what it's like working as a staffer, as a DSA member in New York, where there's a lot of professional staffers who are working in campaign or in elected officials' offices. Do you interact with them at all, and in what ways is it different being a DSA member who's staff than a non-DSA member?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's not one to which I have a particularly exciting response. I am district staff, so I do, basically my job is like tenant organizing, district affairs and neighborhood stuff, and then policy analysis. So I personally don't go up to the state capitol in Albany to support FARA, and we haven't actually done that because there was COVID this year. So I honestly don't know. I have once in a while had email exchanges with other staffers who've been supportive when FARA's taken a tough, controversial stand. There was an instance where, you know, FARA during the sort of bombings in Gaza and, you know, attacks in Jerusalem that were taking place on behalf of the Israeli government, FARA had tweeted out against it. There was quite a bit of backlash. And, you know, I remember like getting a sort of email of support from not necessarily like a staffer for like not that progressive a legislator, and I was like, oh, that's cool. But, you know, I mean, I suspect that it will be complicated and tricky, and that, you know, I think we are literally the enemies of most of the people who are there in Albany, and every assembly member just fucking knows that we might endorse a primary against them, and that we believe they need to go. There have been occasions where our legislators have said so, have been like, you know, if you're going to take this position, or anyone saying this, you know, you should be put on notice that this is going to be on the record and people will come after you for it. You know, we've talked like that on occasion, and sometimes even on the floor of the assembly. So, you know, having, not being cozy with the establishment. I wonder what it's going to be like for our folks up in Albany. I will say, I don't think it's totally isolating. I think, as with everywhere, there's politics to be done and friends to be made. But nobody came ready to put an arm around any of our shoulders and say, "Here's how you do this." We've really had to figure out a lot in the past 8 months.
Thank you. Alvin Rosa, we had Peter ask that he mentions that every city in our chapter area is getting stimulus money from the feds. And one of the big campaigns they have right now is directing that money towards where it can meet the most pressing needs of the most marginalized citizens. Can you talk about what that looks like for the DSA caucus and the Chicago City Council, working with Chicago DSA in general, and how to address that issue of kind of distributing stimulus money wisely?
Absolutely. The city of Chicago is in line to receive about $1.8 billion in funds through the American Rescue Plan. Very regrettably, very shamefully, our mayor, spent the vast majority of our funds through the CARES Act on policing in the city of Chicago. She literally sent the police to our beaches and to our public parks to shut them down. And police literally told people, you have to go to the bars. If you want to be out, when we knew during this pandemic that one of the, safer activities was to gather outside if you're going to engage in social gatherings. I think it was very clear to everyone involved that, that was the mayor's push to shore up profits and revenue for, the restaurant industry and the bar industry. Which the city is very reliant on taxes from, that hospitality industry. And of course, they're a very powerful lobby within the city of Chicago who were threatening the mayor, with, running someone against her if she didn't, help them and reduce restrictions during this pandemic. So we don't want to see a repeat of that again. And so this time we're being very proactive. Members of the Democratic Socialist Caucus of the Chicago City Council have introduced alongside the Progressive Caucus and alongside, the DSA, as well as United Working Families, which is a grouping of grassroots community organizations and is kind of, the left in the city of Chicago in coalition with DSA. We've introduced the Chicago Rescue Plan, which is of course a play on the American Rescue Plan, where we are proposing spending that money that we are in line to receive, in which we can begin expending now on the things that the most marginalized and on the things that working and poor people need in this moment. So we want to spend $130 million on housing the unhoused. We want to spend tens of millions of dollars on mental health first responders that are non-police, right? That are actual social workers and mental health experts that can go out and provide people in mental health crisis with the support that they need, because we know that people that are in mental health crisis are much more likely to be murdered by the police. We want to spend that money on making sure that our youth have jobs, right? So that they have alternatives to the violence that is so prevalent in our Chicago communities, particularly those Chicago communities that have experienced so much disinvestment. So the Chicago Rescue Plan really represents a kind of coming together of grassroots community organizations and nonprofits that have been working many times in silos on these specific social issues in our communities. And I'm very proud that my colleague and my fellow Democratic Socialist in the Chicago City Council, Daniel Espada, is the chief sponsor of that legislation, and I'm proud to be a co-sponsor alongside him. We have 12 of the 50 aldermen in the Chicago City Council that are currently endorsing and sponsoring this legislation. We hope to grow that over the next several months. I was actually in a meeting today from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. to discuss with our grassroots community organizations and with our allied aldermen how we grow this campaign and how we ensure that in the next several months we do what we need to do to win as much as we possibly can for the Chicago Rescue Plan. It's really sad. The city of Chicago is a big Democratic city, yet we're way behind other municipalities like New York that have already done a better job of getting this money out the door and to funding the needs in their communities. I think it just speaks to kind of the role of big money, entrenched right-wing, interests in City Hall, and our neoliberal mayor who cozies up with Republicans as much as she possibly can. But I think that that's just one way that we're approaching this issue in the city of Chicago, and I hope that other municipalities approach this issue in a similar manner. This money is there to make sure that the needs in our communities are being met, and this pandemic exposed so much need in our communities. And one of the things that our mayor has said is that she wants to give the bulk of this money from the American Rescue Plan to Chase Manhattan Bank. Chase Manhattan Bank, which profited off of charging poor people, fees for having overdrafted accounts in the middle of a pandemic, because they needed money to survive, because they didn't have money coming in through the door because they couldn't work. Chase Manhattan Bank, which profited off of poor and working people in this pandemic, they don't need any money, right? The federal government allocated this money to address the needs in our community, and we've got to get that money out the door to serve the needs of the most vulnerable in our community. And it's going to be the Democratic Socialist Caucus in coalition with progressives and leftists that's going to fight to make sure that that happens in the city of Chicago.
Well, I got a lot of people really excited. I think that's an amazing work that's been going on. And I think we can kind of get to the idea of non-reformist reforms that you mentioned earlier, Alderman Rosa. What makes something a non-reformist reform as just opposed to something where you are, bringing material benefit but not doing something making a fundamental change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think sometimes, liberals or centrists, I think they are under the illusion that if we kind of just tweak things on the margins, right, that's really the only change that we need to make to have a better society. And I think that, we understand as socialists that we need to fundamentally transform, our workplaces. We need to fundamentally transform society. We need to shift the balance of power between the capitalist class and the working class. And so for me, a non-reformist reform is one where you are fighting for something that is not, the end of capitalism, right? But helps us bring us closer to that socially and economically just society that we need and that we deserve. It's a reform that will substantially benefit poor and working class people. And it's a reform that, as you fight to win and as you fight to enact that change, that you're bringing more people along. So it's a popular demand. It's something that brings the masses and involves them into that work. And it's one that builds the capacity of our socialist movement to win more in the future. So one way that I can, think of a specific example is the, sanctuary city ordinance that we passed in the city of Chicago. The city already had a sanctuary city ordinance, but it's one that had major exceptions in it. The most glaring exception was one that said that if you were charged with any crime, right, that the local police could turn you over to ICE. Using a fake social security number is technically a crime, right? And so that means that if you were an undocumented person looking to survive and you made up a social security number, you could be charged with a felony. Now, under our sanctuary city ordinance, the city of Chicago could work with ICE to deport you, as it was, prior to the change that we made. If you had an unscrupulous police officer, and which we know there's so many of them, a police officer could charge you with anything, right? Simply to then make you deportable under the sanctuary city ordinance that we had. And so undocumented immigrant activists in the city of Chicago said, we want no exceptions in our sanctuary city ordinance, right? We understand that poor and working class people and brown people, our immigrants, are targeted for criminalization. And so we want to make sure that in no case, no exception, can the city of Chicago work with ICE to deport our residents. And so that was a non-reformist reform because it really struck at, right? The reform was removing specific language from the sanctuary city ordinance, right? But it was non-reformist in the sense that it really struck at the paradigm where immigrants and brown people are criminalized, right? It really struck at that notion that if you have had contact with our broken criminal justice system, that therefore then you are disposable, right? That therefore then you are a bad person deserving of all of the punishment and all of the violence that comes forward from our state. And so it really kind of flipped that notion on its head to say, no, just because you've had contact with our criminal justice system does not mean that you are now a second-class citizen, does not mean that you now are disposable and are treated as less than, right? That was at the heart of that demand. And it was rooted in abolition. It was rooted in the sense of, you know, our criminal justice system is racist, classist, and it needs to be upended. And in that fight to bring about that reform, we brought thousands of people into struggle with us. And so there were direct actions, there were press conferences, there were marches. In my community, we had a number of smaller marches. Of course, we had larger marches downtown at City Hall. But every single step of the way, right, the way that we approached this work, right, it wasn't just, we had wonderful, beautifully written policy briefings because the data and the research backed up everything that we were working on. So of course we had that, and of course we were, you know, distributing that to the mayor and the mayor's staff and distributing that to my colleagues, and we had the ACLU supporting us, and we had wonderful organizations with a lot of good policy chops backing us up. But that wasn't the extent of our campaign, right? The work that we took on was about bringing more people into our movement, about, you know, educating more people about our racist and classist criminal justice system and the way in which it treats poor people and working class people as less than and disposable and targets them for this state violence. So for me, that's the non-reformist reform, right? It's, you're fighting for something that is going to fundamentally improve the lives of working people. But as you're fighting for this issue, you're also challenging, you know, the under, kind of just those fundamental precepts, that foundation of this, you know, racist, classist, capitalist system that we live under. And then you're also bringing people into that struggle, right? And so now when we won this change, there are now literally thousands of people in the city of Chicago that can say, I joined in to make this change. We fought, we won, and now they're going to continue to work alongside of us. Of course, not everyone is going to continue to work alongside of us, but a good chunk of those people are now going to continue to be leaders in our future fights. And so it's literally, you know, help build our capacity to win even more for our communities.
And why don't you take that question and close us out? I've got a couple more minutes.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Carlos gave a great response. I have been thinking a lot about this question as we've been thinking about, like I said earlier, like what does it mean to advocate for a socialist policy agenda? And so in thinking about that, you know, some of us did some reading of looking at like, what is, you know, what's the history of like reforms socialists have pursued in a kind of, you know, big way. You know, we started looking at what they did in Scandinavia in the middle of the 20th century. And there's a very good book that I really recommend if you're interested in thinking about what is socialist policy. That's goes to Esping Anderson, Politics Against Markets, the Social Democratic Road to Socialism. It's very, very interesting. Naturally, conditions are very different in Scandinavia. Our project is very big, but Esping Anderson talks about a few ideas for how to think about policy that I think have been really informative for us, and I think have helped us sort of think about what I think will be one of our big priorities for the coming year, which I'll get to at the end of the comment. But those are basically that they are fundamental, that they are solidaristic. So universal benefits, things that don't create factions of people that are like resenting other factions for getting benefits or not having them. So solidaristic, universal, create a sense of collectivity, sense that like we're all bought into the same thing. It's not like shameful to have this benefit. So many of our benefits today are like that. You know, one only needs to think of like TANF at the federal level, which is just like this really cruel poverty voucher. You know, Section 8, the fact that you have to reapply every year, also, you know, just kind of can feel quite shameful having to go through that process constantly. So are solidaristic, decommodify labor. So what are the things we can do to produce outcomes where the labor market is tighter and where people are less reliant on having to get work in order to live? So this can be things like raising wages, boosting unemployment, also having, you know, more federal than I think what we have the ability to do at the state, although I think we are interested in figuring out, but having like state-driven investment that boosts employment and pushes us towards full employment. Those sorts of things are going to be able to strengthen the power of workers. So you've lessened division with solidaristic policy. You've strengthened power with decommodifying labor. And then we think about policies that increase the capacity to organize or change the class structure in a way. So right now we have, in the United States, it's a really big country. People have a lot of different interests, sort of, think about homeownership, the fact that like millions of Americans are homeowners, which in a very real way buys them into racism. Your property value is directly tied to whether or not there are Black people in your neighborhood, and it immediately drops. This means you support policing. This means you support redlining. This means you want to try to, you don't want to distribute resources out of your community. You want the public schools in your community to be good, but not elsewhere. There's a whole way that our class structure is set up that actually means that, like, not everyone today is like really clear that, yeah, actually socialist policy is the thing that's going to benefit us the most. So how do we actually change that? How do we actually shift what people's interests are by shifting what the class structure looks like and bringing people together more? I think that's a really important sort of concept. The big picture, in the Scandinavian context was like absolutely vital. Was figuring out how to create that coalition and stop the divergence of interests that the ruling class constantly wants. And then the last is that just makes the state have a more positive relationship within society, which I think is all just really vital. We're thinking about fighting for, we are actually getting ready to, we're putting together a campaign to fight for free public college. There's a great public college system in New York called CUNY, City University of New York. And we basically want to push along with the union and students that we've been talking to push to make that free and to massively expand the faculty. I think that would get at doing that, building solidarity, creating something useful, changing the class structure in a way that lifts people up. So I think lots to think about in the idea of like, what is a smart reform? What is a reform that's getting us further than just what this little thing is going to do for us?
Well, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm so glad to have welcomed Alderman Rosa and Finan from New York, and Alderman Rosa from Chicago City Council. And everyone, I hope you'll have a great evening. Solidarity forever.
Thank you, guys. Really wonderful.